Hello, everybody. It's Rebecca from School Psych Podcast here with a special episode of School Psych Podcast, School Psychologist Specialist. It's a mouthful, and I'm working on what to call it. But what we're doing lately is creating a series of podcasts. Designated for parents and school psychologists and school mental health people who work with parents. So, our wonderful guest today is a great person for the specialist series. And I'll just jump right in and introduce him. Today, I'm very pleased to have with me Ned Johnson. He is president and tutor-geek of Prep Matters, an educational company providing academic tutoring, educational planning, and standardized test preparation. A battle-tested veteran of test prep, stress regulation, and student performance, Ned has spent nearly 50,000 one-on-one hours helping students conquer an alphabet of standardized tests, learn to manage their anxiety, and develop their own motivation to succeed. With Dr. William Strixrud, Ned is co-author of one of my favorite books, The Self-Driven Child, The Science and Sense of Giving Your Kids More Control Over Their Lives, and What Do You Say? How to Talk with Kids to Build Motivation. Another excellent book. Oops, sorry, not done with the subtitle. To build motivation, stress tolerance, and a happy home. And he is the host of the Self-Driven Child podcast. Welcome, Ned. I'm so pleased to have you here, and I can't wait to dig in.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Rebecca. I love the work that you're doing, particularly for when we think about school. I think it's easy to think of mental health as kind of an afterthought, but of course, anyone who knows things as well as you do and your listeners, we don't learn if we don't feel psychologically safe, and if we don't feel and we can't feel psychologically safe if we don't have good mental health. So, I think putting the psychological health, the mental health at the sort of bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of learning, I think, is the right way to go about that.
Absolutely. It's so true. And, as a school psychologist working with kids, I often partner with people who do work like you do that help kids prepare themselves for the next level, whatever that is.
Right,
Sometimes
right.
it's high school placement, or if they're switching schools, and sometimes it's college. And I know that it is often very complicated, slightly overwhelming, and really difficult to navigate, both for parents and school support teams, but for kids especially. Um, and I think also, as we've noticed throughout the pandemic and now in this sort of post-pandemic phase, um, anxiety in general among kids
Hmm.
has skyrocketed. Do you think, what do you attribute that to? Do you think that we're putting a lot of pressure on kids to achieve?
Unquestionably, first of all, there are a lot of factors that are involved here, and so a lot of times people want to put me. We were trying to look at if only this one thing were better, then we wouldn't have a problem. And I'm not sure that's quite the right way to think about this. From my perspective, if when the total inflows of stress are not balanced by sufficient outflows of stress, then we can expect all kinds of bad things to happen. But unquestionably, the world that kids are growing up in today is a lot more stressful than the world that we grew up in. And the healthy outflows of stress are sort of taken away from folks a little bit. There's a wonderful book coming out. Just interviewed for my podcast, a journalist named Jennifer Wallace, with a book called Never Enough, and talks about kind of professionalization of childhood and the constant stress, the constant pressure the kids feel under. I learned to know about her, came to know about her. She wrote a piece for the Washington Post about 4 years ago, based on some research by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the National Academies, and it was looking at the causes of stress in American teens. And this pre-COVID. And so the first one was poverty, and grinding poverty is terrible for developing brains. Two is trauma. Three is discrimination in all of its glorious forms. And four was excessive pressure to excel. And nobody would purposely put their kids in a position where they would be discriminated against, or face trauma, or suffer through poverty. And yet somehow we feel as though what we need to do is to push and push and push and push our kids to achieve at a high level. Otherwise, something terrible will happen. literally yesterday, I got an email from a mom who wrote me, said, "I've read both of your books. I love them. My husband and I try to use these, blah, 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 blah. However, I'm really struggling with our 9-year-old son. Despite all of my efforts, I cannot seem to get him to be motivated to dig in more in school." And so I talked on the phone with her about an hour yesterday. Well, tell me more. Well, he's meeting on grade, at his age, they don't have grades. So he's meeting expectations. He's getting 3 out of 4. And so, he's not exceeding, but he's meeting it. And but we're trying to tell him he needs to dig in more, right? This is going to be really important for building his future, right? He needs to develop these executive functions. He needs to work harder. Otherwise, people are going to get ahead of him. I thought, wait, he's 9? So I somewhat tongue in cheek asked whether she and her husband had walked him through the intricacies and the importance, mind you, of a 401k plan. Because, and he's 9, read Peter Gray, this kid should be playing. And
Yes.
and so yes, when you start with a 9-year-old, having kids being constantly under pressure and having those developing brains bathed in a stew of stress hormones is so unbelievably injurious to developing brains. I mean, you can read about ACE scores, right? And what that does to the development of the prefrontal cortex, how it shrinks the hippocampus, which is the major memory center of our brain. When we think about executive functions, which include, of course, cognitive and mental flexibility and emotional flexibility, which, as you know, as a psychologist, is paramount to mental health. That if I really had my friend, my friends were mean to me on the playground, or I bombed a test, or I asked a girl out and she said no, or I got caught from the soccer team, all of these things are hard. But we want me to have the ability to roll with it and put it in context and sort of bounce back from this, because technically resilience is nothing more than the ability to revert back to form, right? And when we know that grinding stress completely goofs up those executive functions, including emotional and cognitive flexibility, how could we possibly be surprised then that kids struggle with mental health challenges at the first sign, at the first sign of adversity? So, yeah, I mean, the way that we're currently going about educating kids with really fear-based thinking, both in the school and more importantly at home, it's not we're not headed down the right path currently.
That's so well said, and I resonate with all of that so deeply as a parent, as a school psychologist working with kids and parents. I think the fear-based piece of it is so important, because it's not that we as adults, like you said, are trying to stress our kids out and make
Yeah.
them anxious, but we're afraid that if they're
Hmm.
not, doing all these things at 8 and 9 and 10, that, who knows what we're worried about might happen in the future. And so often I see a lot of pressure on kids' executive functioning, because it's just not developmentally, our expectations are just not developmentally appropriate. And we're setting them up for failure in those contexts.
And to be patient, right? I mean, I was talking with this mom yesterday. I said we have this idea that growth in all of its forms is linear, right?
Yeah.
And so same way, when you if you can think back to the boy who was the tallest boy in 7th grade, and who was bigger and stronger than everyone else and probably lording it over people, and you want to be like, enjoy it now, buddy,
Right.
because you're not going to be the biggest, strongest kid, statistically, when you get around to senior in high school, right? And so I was 5'2" until I was a junior in high school, right? And so, would you sit there and look at a kid who's yet to go through puberty and have growth spurt and say, would you grow up? And yet, when kids are struggling, and we know that executive functions and development of the prefrontal cortex is highly individualized, right? We look at kids who are struggling and say, would you grow up? And it's like, it's not a reasonable expectation. And what so often happens with kids in school, who they know I'm not doing as well as this kid and that kid and my friends, and everything's hard for me. And of course they feel that.
Yeah.
And of course, and the problem is, the more that we lean on them and the more anxious we make them, this is important for people who don't know this, that the major manifestation of anxiety is avoidance. So
Mm.
kids will avoid the very things that are in their own best interest just because it's so frightening, it's so intimidating. I try and I try and I can't do any better. Well, why would I try harder? I'm inclined to try less hard and tell myself, well, if I could, if I wanted to, just to preserve my own ego.
Yeah.
So for parents who really, of course, you want your kids to be educated because that's such a valuable part of them having lives that they want. But I said to this mom yesterday, I said, look, you can tell him that that school is really important because he's developing himself. And this is going to be important for the life he wants to have. And that you love him from the top of his head to the bottom of his toes. The challenge is when kids feel that, whether it's true or not, when kids feel that our love of them and our approval of them is contingent on how they do in school or even how hard they work. Oops, oops, we've got a problem. And we talk about this in what you say of a chapter about expectations, where parents say, I tell my kids all the time, I don't care how you do, so long as you try your hardest.
Right.
And that rolls off the tongue, and it sounds like I'm such a great parent, but we should remind ourselves that that too is conditional approval. It's contingent approval, right? And
Yeah.
especially if you've got a kid who's struggling with anxiety or depression, for some kids, just freaking getting out of bed in the morning is a really big achievement. And what we talk about in both books is that home should feel like a safe base. Because when we think about mental health, if there's a silver bullet against the effects of stress on developing brains, it's a close connection that a child has with a parent and another caregiver. And why, for the love of all why would you squander that and turn yourself into the homework police? I was lecturing at a local, really good local school where I am, uh, about our second book, What Do You Say? And at the end of it, I was signing some books, and this mom came up, happened to be a Black mom, and she said, I bought your book and I started reading it. Well, this is The Self-Driven Child. I was reading it uh, during the summer of 2020, right? And this is when COVID is raging. It's also, we can remind ourselves, George Floyd
Yeah.
and all of that hard stuff. And she said, to me, it felt like not only was the world on fire with this pandemic, but it felt like America was hunting children who looked like my son.
Yeah.
So you can only imagine how fearful she was. But she said, I read this book and I committed myself that I was going to make home feel like a safe base because no other corner of the world felt safe to my kid. And this is what I was going to make happen. And she said it completely transformed my relationship with my kid because he was, of course, facing, pressure and discrimination and all these things because it's there. And then
Right.
he also wasn't feeling safe at home because his mom was so. And so we changed the energy. So it's hard because our fears for our kids are never about today. They're always about the future. And we tend to make fortune telling errors and we tend to catastrophize. And part of our work as parents is to say, yeah, it really sucks right now. It's really messy for you. Nothing is not going well. And that is hard.
Yeah.
But I'm confident that this is going to work out okay eventually. And it's our job, it's my job to help you figure out how to make that work. And it's so much easier to have kids not avoid the hard work that they need to do and to not be fearful about their futures if we're not worried sick about them too.
That's right. Oh, I love that. And what I'm hearing you talk about is the empathy and validation that you talk about in What Do You Say? And
Hmm.
also that sense of even in difficult circumstances that we as adults don't have control over, the social, political context of the world and real dangers that are out there, we still want to function as their consultant. We want to be honest at a developmentally appropriate level about what's safe and what's
Hmm.
potentially not safe, but
Hmm.
we still want to prepare our kids for the worlds that they live in and not overprotect them. How do you suggest we do that? First, we have to
Well,
identify our own fear, right?
yeah, we do. I mean, and part of it is, and so for both the work that you do and the advice I try to give to parents, of course, in no point, I don't want anyone to feel that we're saying you did this wrong, whatever, because everything that you're doing as a parent is well intended because you love your kids and you want to protect them and you want to see them thrive. Noted. The challenge is if we think about the first role that we fall into as parents with these little tiny things who burble at us but can't do a darn thing, it is our job as parents to protect our infants and to soothe them because they haven't learned how to do that for themselves. But as they transition developmentally appropriately, as you note, we need to transfer that energy from how do we keep them safe to how do we teach them to be safe themselves. Because the challenge is if we are constantly saving them from everything including emotional distress, They never feel that that is within them. And this is, it's a terrible disservice to do to children. There's, in the self-driven child, we talk about the research of a guy named Steve Mayer, who's most well known for research on what was called learned helplessness, where they took these animals and mistreated them, and then they would leave them in this cage, and they'd open the door and they'd shock them, and they would just sit there. They wouldn't jump over the wall and try. They'd just sit there and endure it. And so they did this really important paper called "Learned Helplessness at 50" about what do we get right and what do we get wrong. And what they said, what we got wrong was this: it was not that these animals learned to be helpless, but rather that they failed to ever learn a sense of control.
Mhm.
So here's what happens at a neurological level. They in this case, they had rats in a cage, their tails are out the back, and they administered a mild electric shock. So it's adverse experience. It's not life threatening, but it's pretty annoying. It doesn't feel good, makes them unhappy. Rat A has this little wheel that he can spin and it stops the shock. When he's in a difficult situation, it's unpleasant, but he realizes there's something he can do. There's this massive activation of the left frontal lobe of the prefrontal cortex. And that part of that's where the executive functions lie. He puts things into context. And at a neurological level, this is what coping looks like, including it dampens down the stress response in the amygdala. They do this back and forth over and over and over. And these connections between the PFC and the amygdala grow. Turns out that the strength of those connections is the single strongest neurological marker of mental health. So that's a good thing. They then put this rat in other experiences, loud, scary music, blah, 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 and he doesn't freak out. He doesn't hide in the corner. This experience of being able to cope in a hard situation is trans-situational. I mean, he then takes that learned lesson and applies it into other situations. Rat B, also in a cage, also getting shocked, also has a wheel. He can spin the wheel, but it doesn't do a thing. So he's experiencing this, but he can't do anything to be effectual in changing the situation. He's a basket case. You put him in another situation, he just hides in the corner and cowers. Here's the really neat thing that they did. They then yoked the two rats. So rat A, so Rebecca rat spins the wheel. She saves herself. She also saves me. Oh my gosh, I am so grateful. Thank you. You stopped the shock. But the problem is, I remain a basket case because I'm like a damsel in distress. I am forever saved, and I'm looking to the sky for someone else to save me.
Mhm.
And so the part that's hard for us as parents, and you of course know this in your work, is we want to offer help. And we want, so when you kind of, what do we do? I'll come back. The two big things are we use empathy and validation, and then we move into this consultant role. And the empathy and validation is when you see your kid is upset, their friend breaks up with them, they don't get the lead in the play, whatever, they get a bad grade, and they are upset. Here's the mistake that we as parents always fall into. There's something called the righting reflex, meaning that if I start telling someone about my problem, almost if that person is a friend of mine or my wife, whatever, they naturally start thinking, well, Ned, what if you tried this? Have you tried this? Have you thought about this? Right? Or, oh man, but I mean, come on, it's not that big a deal. It's just one parking ticket. Everybody has a car crash. You didn't like them anyway. You didn't like that job anyway. And we start trying to give me reasons to feel differently about the thing that I feel. Got it. And it's all well intended. But the problem is on the receiving end, it feels like, well, Ned, if you'd done this or this or this or the five things I can immediately rattle off my head, you wouldn't be in this situation, you dope, which really doesn't make me feel good because it makes me feel like woulda, shoulda, coulda.
Yeah.
Or when you're saying, hey, you never really liked this anyway, it's basically saying you really shouldn't be upset about the things that you're upset about. And it feels very invalidating.
Right.
So what we want to do is simply validate and say, gosh, man, you're pretty bummed out about that. I get it. You've been with that company for a year and a half and they're not recognizing what you're doing. I'd be upset about that too. You don't even have to agree with the facts, right? A kid who comes home spitting mad about how they studied hard on the test and they did terribly, and in your head, you're like, dude, study? You were on Xbox the whole day, right? You can say something like, golly, I'd be upset. Note that I'd be conditional. I'd be upset too if I felt like I had studied really hard and the test hadn't gone well. Note, we didn't agree with the facts. We
Mhm.
just said, and it's the experience when you feel like someone else is trying to understand your perspective. That's what calms hard emotions. It's not logic or here's the solution. It's like, yeah, it is so hard. I am so mad. I've worked so hard at this. And
Yeah.
when we do that, that's what calms hard feelings. And then that positions us to then be able to be a consultant as we talk about. And the three implications there are that we want to offer help and offer advice, not rather than telling, here's what you should do, say, I wonder if it'll be, I've got an idea on this. Would you like to hear it? And when we give them a choice of do they want this advice or not, it's much less likely to excite kind of their defensiveness. It makes it much more likely that they hear what we say. We also want to help kids solve their own problems, and certainly for kids in middle school above any age, right? So, well, let's talk through this. I wonder what our options are. Yes, as a parent with a fully developed brain, you probably know the solution, but we don't want to just give them the solution. We want to do everything we can to help them come to the solution themselves, because if they do that, then they feel like the solution again is within there rather than looking at RAD A to solve them. And then the last thing is we want them to have as much experience as they can solving hard things, because one of the things that's most conducive to having confidence about your ability to run the world is to have the experience solving hard things, to have the experience solving problems. So you again can anticipate, well, if this doesn't go well, I'm sure that I can figure this out going along. So there's a really fun story in what you say where Bill and I were lecturing in Palo Alto, and the very next day, we get this email from the person who set this up, from a mom who'd come home and found her seventh grader in tears. And said, Mom, I'm the weakest boy in all the seventh grade, and he's just a mess. And she said, normally I would have said something like, well, kiddo, that can't possibly be true. I know there are lots of other kids, Okay, I'm disagreeing with his version of the facts. Or, oh my goodness, but you're so good at, look, you're like the best math student there is. Or, everybody in your family's, all these things that all make sense. Or we'll get you a personal trainer. We'll figure this out. But in that moment, right? And part of it, we do this as parents because when our kids are upset, we want to solve the problem. So we don't have to be upset about the fact that they're upset. So I'm just, I've been there, done that, obviously. And she said, I bit my tongue and I just said, oh man, you're really upset about this, huh? He's like, sure I am. I said, well, I get that. I mean, golly, if I felt like everyone else is getting big and strong and I'm not there yet either, I'd be upset. I get why you're upset about this. And they kind of went back and forth on this. And one of the things that I did there, we talk about in the book, is reflective listening. And this guy named Ron McGinn talks about wigging, which is what I got is. And you just kind of repeat back to someone what you heard. And so they did a few rounds of this where she said this. She said, did I get this right? And back, empathy, validate. She gives him a hug. He dries his eyes a little bit, gives mom a hug, goes to bed. She's like, oh my gosh. They're like, I don't know what to do. The next day, the kid comes down to breakfast with a plan. Oh, sorry, with a written plan
Oh, wow.
for how he thinks he can gain strength, and asks his mom for help. And that's
Wow.
you can't imagine a better outcome for that than he sat there and thought about something that's hard, thought about something that makes him upset, thought about what's the plan for it. And then he started to solicit the people who can help him. And of course, as parents, we want to help, but it's basically the same outcome, but
Yeah.
with a wildly different path.
With his own autonomy involved.
Yep.
It was
Yep.
his idea. That's
Yep.
beautiful. I want to go back to the call you got about the unmotivated child, because we see and hear this a lot.
Yes, we do.
Kids that are, maybe fine, but they seem, do you want to, oh, there's this happening after school, or this team you can try out for. There's things that we think of as adults would be great for our kids to participate in, to pursue. And sometimes they just seem unmotivated. That could be avoidance. It could be
Hmm.
anxiety. It could be a lot of things. So, but what do you suggest for motivation? Is it the same? It's similar, I'm gathering, that we want
Yeah.
to give them the autonomy, but how long do we sit back and let them do the
Well,
least?
yeah. So there are a few things here. First of all, you can't make people want what they don't want.
Yeah.
And you can't make them not want what they do want. It's just the way things work. So what you often want to do is to try to figure a way that was contingent. So I was talking with this family and I was asking about, and the mom started going on this, academics, and a couple years from now he's got to take the ISE because we want him to go to independent schools, and on and on and on. And so I started with the end in mind. I said, well, does he want to go to an independent school? She said, no, not really. I'm like, you have dealt yourself a really hard hand. You're trying to get him to do homework that he doesn't want to get grades that he doesn't care about, to get into school that he doesn't want to go to. Good luck. Good
Yeah.
luck. I said, now tell me, what is he into? And she said, well, he's really into hockey. I said, great. So what does he like about hockey? And she tells me all about it. He's a sort of typical boy. I said, here's my advice. I said, are the hockey teams at any of these independent schools that you and your husband are looking at, do they good? She's like, well, they're really good. I said, what if you just casually go to a hockey game and with these independent schools? And it's like, golly, this place is great. I love this rink. And it's only 20 minutes away rather than an hour going to, whatever, whatever, whatever. Now he has a reason to go to there, right?
Right.
So we can get at things in a sideways with this kid, and I'll come back and answer your question in a really specific way, I hope. Um, I said the chances are with wanting to do better in school, wanting him to do work harder in school. I said we often think about motivation as kind of a continuum, low end motivation, high motivation. But the way that I think about this is actually motivation is on one axis and demotivation or reason to oppose it is on another.
Mhm.
So he may have low motivation, or maybe not have relatively high motivation. He wants to do well in school. He wants to make his parents happy. He wants to impress his teacher. But if he's a boy's boy, he may also have reason to not work any harder because it's like, dude, how'd you do? And how'd you go on the test? Yeah, I got an A. How long did you study? Studied for an hour. My mom made me do it. Like the other kids, like, yeah, I studied for 50 minutes. Other kids, like, yeah, I studied at the stop signs on the way to school, right? And so, for all we know, he has reasons to not want to work hard. That has to do with peer approval. We don't know, right? We don't know. And so, if you think about this idea as a parent consultant, we want to have as much curiosity as we can to try to understand our kids' perspective rather than just giving them all of our reasons, because what we're trying to do is to help them have their own reasons to want to work hard at whatever it is that's in their own best interest. Now, if you have a kid who doesn't want to, we had an article we wrote for the Post about the quitter's ditch, where kids kind of they start things and they stop and they never engage with them at all. If you can see, gosh, it'd be better if my kid did some exercise or did some sport to get exercise, or better if they instrument or whatever. What we want to do from our perspective, we have a chapter in the Self-Driven Child. We said it's your call, kids as decision makers. And so we want to do this in a way that's tentative, because we can't make a kid practice. Good luck with that. Just go back and reread Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mom. Other people forget that Amy Chua actually lost that battle with her younger daughter. What we want to do is say, I was thinking about, art, sports, music, whatever. I said, I wanted to run something by you. Is okay? Is now a good time, or do you want to can we maybe talk about this later this week? We pick the time so we don't drop an agenda on kids when it feels intense to us, because if it does, we're going to excite their stress response. You then say, I'd love to talk about, maybe picking up soccer again. I know you dropped it a couple years ago, and talk about whether that's something you might want to do. And the kid may do this, but mom, you say, listen, it's going to be your call. I'm obviously, I can't make you play soccer. I mean, that'd be the silliest thing in the world. It's not like you're in remote control. There's no FIFA soccer here. But can we just talk through it, and it'll be your call. And when you take force off the table,
Yeah.
then you can have a more open conversation about the pros and cons about this. So I see this, Bill, and I see this all the time with kids who want to, parents want the kids to go to this school and that school. And from our perspective, you should, unless the kids are going to make a decision that's crazy, meaning 19 out of 20 people say that's a terrible idea. You want to say, look, it's going to be your call, because they're so much more likely to be open with you and think through it. And whatever decision they come to, they're so much more likely to own it. So I'll tell you, I had this kid years ago. I do all this test prep there. This kid, SSHE, and this kid was friggin' brilliant. He was like the middle school debate champion of DC as well.
Yeah.
Super fast brain, also very anxious, and because of that, very rigid. And his mom was super intense. And so he was at this one independent school. They were thinking about switching to another one. The kid had not had the chance to visit this other school. So his test is this Saturday. We met on Tuesday. His test is on Saturday. He's visiting the school the following Tuesday. He's like, well, why should I even take this test? I don't even know if I'll like this school. And so I ran through all the things any normal parent would. Well, you'll have the option to it, and this way you can choose, and blah, blah, blah. And he wasn't having it at all, in part because he felt like this was being done to him, not with him or for him. Mom comes in. It's like, Brett, this is ridiculous. Well, you're taking that test and he just about hit the roof. And I'd sort of do one of these. I said, can we hold on for 1 second? Listen, kiddo, I'll be right back. Just, and we'll be right back. I'm just going to talk with your mom. And I say to her, listen, You can force him there. You can drag him there. But when as soon as he gets in the room, he can just go A. You can't make him do it. I said, what I would like to suggest is this. And so I made this proposal to her, and I'll tell you in a moment. And then we get this, I don't tell the story twice. I go in, I said, listen, your mom and I talked about this. This is your call. If you don't want to take the test, we will stand behind that. And your mom will say nothing more. She has promised me. We have a witness here. And I will say nothing more either. It is your choice whether you take this test or not. Because listen, this is your life. This is your education. But I will call you, and your mom is not going to talk about this at all. I want you to think about this for 2 days, and I am going to call you on Thursday, and then you're going to tell me yes or no, and you're just going to tell me why. And I don't care whether you say yes or no or what your reasons are. I want to sleep late and have Fruit Loops on Saturday. I don't care. All I care is that you think through, because you've heard all the reasons for, and you know the reasons against. So he says, is that a deal? And he's shaking. He's so upset. He said, okay. And I repeat the whole thing twice, and everyone's promised. They leave. I get a text from mom 7 minutes later. He said, I can't believe you embarrassed me like that, but I'll take the stupid test on Saturday.
Oh.
And when we take force off, and here's the thing, particularly for kids who have anger or who have a temper or who we feel like throw tantrums all the time, particularly for little kids, please know this. These are not misbehaving kids. Kids who have that temperament, almost always, they simply have more sensitive stress responses. Mm-hmm. And so it never occurs to us, the kids who are acting out, that they're actually more sensitive than quote unquote normal kids are. Yeah. And so it's doubly important that we don't use the force of our will to try to get them to do things. Because what I ultimately said, when we go back to the question about motivation, the dominant model for motivation, apart from using carrots and sticks, and I'll take your cell phone if you don't do that, you can do that, but good luck with that long term. The most supported model for intrinsic motivation, meaning not getting kids to work hard, but helping kids feel like they want to work hard, is called self-determination theory. And it has 3 psychological needs: a sense of competency, a sense of relatedness, a sense of autonomy. And most of our effort as parents, as teachers, is always on competency, push the skills, more tutoring, more homework, more. And there's a place for that, more practice. I get it. But it has to be, it's a 3-legged stool. It has to have relatedness. So we know that our students, or when we were students, we work harder for people who like us and people who we like. It's just how brains work. And then, of course, autonomy. We're following the research of this clinician who studies the need for autonomy in 2-year-olds. And kids in kindergarten have more autonomy typically than teenagers do. And what I said to this mom yesterday, I said, the challenge is your kid, he sounds like a lovely boy, the way she described it. I said, he's going along, he doesn't really want to do this, but he's going along because partly because he loves you, right? And he wants mom to be proud of him, but also because he couldn't risk blowing up their relationship with him. He's 9. He doesn't have a credit card. Where's he going to go? What's he going to do if he doesn't have mom or dad? But what he's having to do is he's sacrificing his autonomy to hold on to his relatedness. And this is not a good thing to do, because kids are supposed to develop their autonomy more and more, particularly when they get to adolescence, because they need to individuate and be their own people so they can go out and have their own lives. And that's what I worry about, is that he will go along with this. And at some point, particularly he goes through puberty and into teenage years, he will have a big catching up of his need for autonomy. And all of a sudden he'll be rebellious and he'll be like, where the heck did this come from? He was always such a good boy. But he may have been a good boy because he needed to be a good boy simply to hold on to the connection. But he sacrificed his autonomy. Yeah. And so she said, I never thought about this. So from my perspective, the most valuable thing that we as parents can do is focus on our relationship, partly because from a mental health perspective, the single strongest protective factor is, again, the connection between a parent and a caregiver. But also when we think about motivation, with intrinsic motivation, there are a number of different stages, but one of them is the degree to which kids internalize our values. They really make them their own. Yeah. And the closer a kid feels to mom or to dad or to anyone else, the more likely they are to pick up on the other people's values. So curiously, all that we really, if we love our kids enormously and we keep and we model for them working hard, it's very likely that they're going to pick up that's just what you do. Or if we use great manners all the time, that's just what you do. Please say thank you. They watch us say thank you, you
It's
know?
yes. Yes. And the importance of modeling our values too. Like, if we want our kids to be readers, yet we never open a book, that's
Yeah.
it's less likely because again, it pushes on their autonomy and we're not modeling it in our relationship. I think that's so important. I love all that you're saying. And I love the way you have pulled from all the literature and put it together so effortlessly. It seems, I'm
Well,
sure it was
what
great.
and it well, you know, and it's funny for me because my writing partner is a clinical neuropsychologist. He just knows if you've got a kid where learning's hard, attention's hard, emotional regulation. So he basically spends his whole time trying to figure out how kids' brains work and how do we support them. I've spent since 1993, I've spent all of my time with teenagers, and I'm constantly trying to figure out how do I help them shift their thinking? How do I help them reframe? How do I help them be more well rested? How do I help them feel more motivated? Because I don't have a carrot or stick, right? I don't grade them. I'm not writing the recommendation. I can't take away their self, but I got nothing, right? And so it's how do I help kids, want to do this?
Yeah.
And I will say this. I was talking that they were talking about their standardized tests, and so I said the one thing that I really want kids to do a little bit more than they probably do is read a little bit more. By and large, most kids won't read novels today because nobody parents don't either. No one seems to have the attention span for that.
Right.
And so it was talking about she was talking about how he's into hockey. So now he's now reading the Boston Globe and reading sports section. I said, any reading you do is good.
Yeah.
Any reading you do is good. I said, but for kids who really, really, really just they have no natural interest in doing this thing, there is a place for using incentives. But we can use incentives in ways that still support autonomy. So Bill's son Elliot, who's now probably 40, when he was a kid, he had ADHD, had learning disabilities. Learning was hard. He was, and so like papers, he'd often dash them off. And Bill would say things like, listen, I can see you're really struggling to write this paper. And I know because you just don't have enough dopamine in your head. That's just what's going on. If it would help you, if you would help you, don't do it for me, but if it would help you, I'd be willing to give you $5. If the thought of that $5 could help you get on this. But we offer it as an incentive, not if you do this, I'll give you $5. It's a subtle change. If you get an A, I'll do this. Right? If you read this book, I'll pay. Because once we start paying kids for things where they might be intrinsically motivated, they'll only ever do it for that reward again. But so I have a family I work with, very sophisticated, and these boys were this incredibly, incredibly successful affluent family, endless sums of money. And the boys didn't really like to read; they just wanted to play sports all the time. And there are three boys, 2 years apart from all of them. Mom curiously actually runs a literacy program in DC. She's an incredible human. And she said to boys, listen, it was one summer, a reading challenge. I'll give you a penny for every page you read. If you want to take this on, well, we'll see who wins, right? And it was more, it was one, take mom's money, and two, beat my dopey brother, right? And they ended up with like $3.43. So like, it's not like, it meant nothing, right? But she did it in a way that was support, that was not, it wasn't forcing them to do it. And it wasn't coercive. It's
Yeah.
using, I can see that this is hard for you to do. If it help, when you get the stupid paper done, here's my favorite example of this. So my daughter was full school refusal for the last 3 months of 8th grade. It's a long story. She's doing great now, but golly, was this a thing. And she was becoming more and more anxious and more wanting to avoid school. And we know that with the more you avoid, the more it reinforces it, right?
Yeah.
So I was constantly, and every day, so we had a lot of going to get strawberry size at Starbucks and whatever. And
Mhm.
she had this ridiculous history test to take. Even I was looking this stuff in like, you've got to be kidding me. And she didn't want to take it. And she had a bad connection with the teacher, on and on it went. And I said, listen, I said, for me, all that I really care is I think there's value to your being in school. I couldn't give a fig about how you do on this test. My daughter was very much a pleaser and really wanted to do well, but
Yeah.
really felt that she couldn't. And I said, listen, I couldn't care. She said, but I'm going to fail the test. I said, you're going to fail it? She said, yeah. I said, are you sure? She said, yeah. I said, you're not going to like a B- on there. She said, no, it's going to fail. I said, listen, not a C or a D. She said, no, I'm going to fail. I said, here's my deal for you. If you could go, and you don't have to, tentative language, but if you would go to school and take this silly test, and I agree with you, take her side of it. I agree. Test is ridiculous.
Yeah.
14 major Greek, sculptors, not sculptures, sculptors. Give me a break. There's so many letters in these names. I said, but if you go and take this test and you fail it, because I don't want to hear about some B minus, and you fail it, here's what I will do. As soon as you're done with that test, I will sign you out of school. We can take off the rest of the day. We will go out to lunch at the Silver Diner, her favorite place to go, and we will have ice cream with lunch at 11:45 on a Tuesday.
It's
She's
great.
like, what? Swear to God we did it, right? Because what I wanted, I was trying to help her not avoid, and I
Yeah.
wanted her to understand to explain to her why I thought this was valuable, but also that my connection to her mattered more than this silly test, right? Because like she was going to remember this stuff in an adult. Give me a break.
Yes. The important thing is that she handled that feeling of
Yep.
anxiety, the
Yep.
certainty she was going to fail. She went through that. She got through it, and
Yep.
then it reinforced in your relationship because you
Yep.
had such a special day. Wow, I bet she'll remember that her whole life.
She still likes ice cream.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Wow. It's so moving just to hear you talk about not only that example, but just how our relationship as parents to our children is primary because it's such a relief too. As I think about it as a parent, my kids are adults now, but
Mhm.
still, one of my favorite lines that I'm still using with my adult kids from your book is, "I love you too much to argue about this, to
Right,
fight about,"
right,
because
right, right.
it's those power struggles that we get into because we're worried about what they're going to decide, or we think, maybe our idea is better. It truly isn't worth it. And the other thing that I love about what you're saying, it makes me think of how important it is as a consultant to have people around you that they can consult with too. Because a lot of times I could say what I think of as like a brilliant analysis of the
Mhm,
situation.
mhm.
They won't hear it from me. They'll think it's stupid. It's not, whatever. I have no idea what I'm talking about. But they'll ask my sister, or they'll
Yep.
ask, a friend or someone else's parent, and they'll be like, what so and so said? It's the exact same thing.
It's such a good point. I mean, I laugh endlessly because, um, in the work that I do, a friend of mine pointed out, "Well, Ned, sometimes you're the gardener and sometimes you're the guru." And some people say, "Well, just thank you." But for other people, there are families where, "Well, Ned said, well, Ned said, well, Ned said," and I laugh because it's in some ways it's so unfair. I'm confident that I'm giving advice that's very similar to what their parents have already told them. But of course, exactly your point, if it's someone outside the household, it can have sort of instant credibility.
Yeah.
But it's also something that can help us as parents be less stressed because we feel like all the lessons that are important in the world, if I don't teach my kid to do this or let them know that they're never going to learn it. Well, first of all, people TikTok, so there's that. But also that we don't have to be everything for our kids. Lisa D'Amour, who, Emotional Life with Teenagers and Untangled and, just wonderful stuff,
Yeah.
talks about the kids need someone to tell their problems to, they need someone to tell their secrets to, and they need someone to spend their time with, right? But those three things don't have to be met by the same person all the time. There's so many other people around your kids who can be helpful. And I'll never forget when I had a family worked with, this is almost 30 years ago. I was, 20 nothing at the time. Mom was actually a psychologist herself. And I had this good relationship with a kid, and she said, "You won't understand. You won't understand until you have children of your own, how valuable it is to have other adults around your kids whom you can trust, who have your kids' best interests at heart."
Yeah.
And she was right. I didn't really get that until my kids were teenagers themselves and having their own challenges, by a bunch of health issues. We probably won't talk about that today. But it's like, oh my gosh, yeah,
Yeah.
but it is a way for us. We want to be thoughtful about in a perfect world who are the adults we try to angle our kids towards a little bit or angle towards our kids a little bit. But also it's something where in a perfect we don't have to be anxious all the time and thinking that we have to know all the answers and provide everything to our kids. That there are other in a perfect world there are other people who will also care about our kids and want to see them do well.
Absolutely. And as a working in a school, working with parents, it's such a beautiful part of my job is to partner with parents, even when it's completely behind the scenes. Those
Yeah,
conversations,
yeah.
understanding from home to school are just invaluable. So plug to all your parents, call your outside support team, call them, let them know what's happening, lean on us because we're so much more helpful together than separately.
Well, and the other thing about that, I'm thinking about the middle school counselor, my daughter's school, I mean, she's a wonderful, wonderful educator.
Yeah.
And part of it also is that we as parents we don't always see our kids in full.
Yeah.
We don't ever see kids in full because one of the things that this back to Lisa D'Amour talks about, the kids will so often hold things together at school, and then they get just across the threshold of the door, and it's just, and she describes it, emotional garbage, right? And they just, because it's not safe to have a meltdown at school, but
Right.
it's safe to have a meltdown at home. And so for parents, a lot of times, I can't believe they treat me that badly. Please note when your kids on you, this is a measure, you should take that as a compliment.
Right.
Take it as a compliment that you have made a home safe enough that they can do that. The kids we worry most about, who, because all kids, everybody has hard days and has hard times and has hard feelings. The
Yeah.
people we worry most about are kids who have the same hard feelings, who have nobody to share those hard things with.
Mm.
So if you're the first parent they see and they just come and like all over you, this is where you do empathy and validation, and you're under no obligation. You probably don't want to try to solve that. But also back to the point about school counselor, we can oftentimes hear about the worst when their kids come home, and we may not know all the ways that they're really handling things well at school. And
Right.
when you talk with a school counselor, they can say, "Oh my gosh," or their kid's teacher, "Well, she did the coolest thing of the day. She was really great. She handled this. Someone said something mean to her, and she handled it really capably. Or she saw that her friend was really upset, and she was really so thoughtful about this." And you can like, oh my gosh, and it's so good to hear about how well your kids can be functioning in school, and because you may only hear the hard stuff. So yeah, in a perfect world, we've got a whole team of adults who are working with each other to support the best for every kid.
That's right. Yeah. So I want to be respectful of your time. I know we're coming up to the end, but I'd love for you to just let our parent audience out there know in on something that you feel that we haven't covered yet in this conversation. And maybe I love the way you had examples in the
Yeah,
scripts in
yeah.
what you say. Um, for parents listening who start of a new school year, there's bound to be some nervousness or some anxiety. They want their kids to feel autonomous and competent and successful. What's a good back to school kind of script or conversation? What are some things that parents can say?
Well, there's a lot of things. I mean, there are a bunch of things. I mean, certainly when we start school, one thing is sort of goal setting thing, is to ask them, do you have goals for this year, right? And it needs to be age appropriate, right? But for them to start to think about and really work hard not to put your thumb on the scale to get them to do this, that, the other, because particularly every year that your kid gets older, they're likely to share with you less and less, right? And
Yeah,
you're trying to keep that open because the things that they're going to get into become more and more sophisticated and more consequential, right? And so, when we were writing the subject and child, my wife and I, there's a story in the book where my son who's ADHD and the loveliest kid in the world. My wife was trying to help him with some homework, and something was not done. And she sort of turned and said, "Why don't you hand this in?" Because ADHD boy, and he responded with the same energy, "Because you didn't remind me." And I'm like, "Okay, wait, 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 wait." Sort of took out a timeout, and I go over. I say, "Listen, kiddo," I said, "In case we weren't clear, this is your school, right? Mom's already done fifth grade, okay? So this is your chance for it, right? So we really, and first of all, let's not throw mom under the bus. That's probably just not a good plan." But I went over to her later. I said, "Listen, first of all, obviously bad manners that has to come from my side of the family, but 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 you can sort of see why he feels that way because my wife is just executive function out her ears, right? So she can be on top of her schedule, my son's schedule, my daughter's schedule. Rebecca, if you need a schedule, we can put her in. You know, very, very reasonable rate. She's just, she's an incredible human, right?
Yeah.
And so for most parents, particularly moms, particularly with boys, it's probably been a while since they've had the brain of, 12-year-old boy, right? And so we just really want to make this pivot towards being this consultant, and because we want to have our kids keep bringing things to us. When you talk about goals, if you came as a consultant, the first thing you do is say, "Well, tell me what's going on, Ed. What's easy, what's hard? Kind of what do you want? Where do you want to get from there?" If your kid is willing to engage in this, we in what do you say? We talk about mental contrast. It's in the self-driven child, mental contrasting, and this acronym of WHOOP. And it's what do you wish for? O, what's the specific outcome you want? O is what's the obstacle, and then P is what's the plan for that, right? So I was thinking about going up for the soccer team. Oh, that's cool. Well, what would be fun about that? And so you get into all the emotion of it. You're immediately thinking, well, how are you going to get your homework done? Oh my God, don't do that. Because you shut down his drive for this. Well, that sounds like fun. Well, what's the best thing about that? Okay, so if you're going to play soccer, which team would you play in or whatever? What's the specific outcome? Okay, well, you haven't been on. Then we transition into obstacles. So, like, what do you think you need to do to be on this? I would probably do have to get you some cleats, right? And let your kids start talking about the boxes that have to be checked to get there. And
Yeah.
then you say, well, okay, so you got to be able to, I don't know, the coach says you got to be able to run a mile in this many minutes. So how do you think we could go about that, right? And it's so easy to go, we'll do this, 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 and this. Oh my gosh, we want to get out of that process. The second part to it that I would say is we talk about in the self-driven child, the idea of being a non-anxious presence.
Yeah.
And then the language of this. And this is where it's so hard because all of our fears really are not about the present, they're about the future. And if our kid is struggling, the first time they get a bad grade, we jump into, I've got to save the day. But when we do that, we risk being, the more that we do that, the more likely we are to struggle with giving kids autonomy and allowing them the opportunity to clean up their own messes, which is so powerful back to Rad A and Rad B. The second thing we're doing is telling them that in some ways you're not acceptable. We're not using those words, but it can feel to kids, you're not acceptable to me if your grades, your social life, your sports, whatever, your room is a mess. You have to correct this. Only then will I relax. And kids read that as back to contingent approval. My parents approve of me when every moment of my life looks perfect, right? That's not a very happy lesson. And we can get into perfectionism. We can talk about that in the book. And the third thing is this: we can only help kids solve problems that we know about. And when they bring a problem to us and we respond with great energy, oftentimes they don't want to do that. One, because I don't want my dad to be upset. I don't want my mom to worry.
Right.
But also they're getting a message of, oh gosh, just, take this to somebody else. And again, the problems that kids are likely to face become more consequential as they get older. There's a story in What Do You Say that I love, and I really pin this on my wife and I turning away from being, how do you, be on top of his homework, to being a consultant. Would you like help with that? No, I got it, Dad. Okay, great. Were the grades perfect? Oh, heck no. But that was not the goal.
Yeah.
So his sophomore year, we're out for a walk, and he's telling me there's a party. No, there's a school dance. He said, I got a question. I said, sure, kid, what's your question? So I got invited to this party after the dance. Oh, really? Well, tell me. And he sort of tiptoes around it and eventually gets around to, so what do I do if they're drinking alcohol there?
Right.
That's the vulnerable question. My kid has never been to like a real party. That's a real question. Alcohol, you're not going, who are these parents? I could not only shut down that party, but shut down his entire social life before it's even begun. But that's not the way that we roll. And I said, well, tell me more. And so he went on and on and on, and eventually came out about, he'd heard this sort of cautionary tale about a party where some girl had gotten really, 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 really drunk to the point that like somebody had to call 911. 911 was called. All the sirens show up. The kids scatter like roaches under the light. Off they go. This one girl stays with this really sick girl to make sure that she's okay. Now, this good Samaritan is at a party where alcohol is being served, and she gets a $500 citation. And
Wow.
so the way this story went around was basically, don't be there when bad things are being done.
Ah,
So he's anxious about going to this party, and I don't want him. And my kid was very late to start with substances, which is the most important thing about substances: is start late, don't start early. Thank you, Matthew. And I said, well, I said, there's another way to look at this. And the temptation is to keep our kids away from hard. We go back to the start of this conversation, to keep our kids away from hard things. Like it's my job to protect him. I need him to be able to protect himself in those situations, because people, of course, dude, try this, try that. I need him to be able to navigate this in a way that he can think clearly for himself. And I simply said, so I didn't want to shield him from this. And I said, well, kiddo, there's another way to think about this. And he said, what's that? And I said, this Good Samaritan kid who got stuck with 500, that's a lot of babysitting money.
Yeah.
I said, you can make the argument that this girl just spent $500 of her hard-earned money to save the life of someone else's kid.
Wow.
So I don't know. And so when I think about this, the most important thing is that we open those conversations, we keep those conversations going, because we want to help our kids solve hard problems when they get them, and we cannot help them with problems that we don't know about.
That's right. Wow. What a powerful story.
He's a great kid. He's a
Wow.
great kid.
Yeah. I love that. And it's a really important conversation, and to have your child bring it up and want and
And
ask your opinion is huge.
and to feel safe to do that.
Yeah.
And kids feel safe when we feel like we're not overly anxious or overly reactive about anything that doesn't go well. You didn't get a good grade, your room's a mess, or whatever.
Yeah.
We want, because the world is increasingly more intense,
Mm.
we want home to feel increasingly like a safe place.
Absolutely. Lisa D'Amour talks about saying in that after school emotional dump moment, or when a child is venting their stressors, to ask them, do you want me to just listen, or would it be
Hmm.
helpful for me to
Yeah.
share what I think?
Yeah. Do you want a hug? Do you want an ear, a hug, or help? I think
Yeah.
something like that. She says it really fitly. Yeah. No, yeah. People, if you haven't yet started following her, she's got among other things, a podcast called Ask Lisa, and she's unquestionably, I mean, if not the best, one of the best thinkers in all of this stuff. Yeah, she's really. I
Yes.
adore the way that she sees the world.
Well, thank you, because she's a former podcast guest, and we
Oh, good.
of you that way too. So
Yeah.
we're really grateful for your time today. Your books are so helpful and so readable. I highly recommend parents out there pick up What Do You Say, and The Self-Driven Child. They're
Yeah.
excellent. And even with my adult children, I'm still referring to them when I need to. And just thank you. So any last thoughts or anything that I haven't asked you that you think would be important? And then please let us know where we can find you.
Yes, so you can find me, on all the social media channels. And it's either Ned Johnson or Self-Driven Child, and my TikTok is the other Ned Johnson. I've had great fun with that. I think I have the personality for TikTok. It's a vaguely manic over there. Um, the thing I just go back to is, I mean, parenting isn't easy, and being a kid right now, this may be the hardest time in the last 3 years in the history of parenting. And so if it's been hard for you or your kid, give yourself a little grace, right? The only perfect parents I know are people who who don't have children yet, right? And for the rest of us, we're doing the best we can. But for me, if increasingly in today's world, if you're not sure what to do, make it your highest priority just to enjoy your kid. Because when we think about that non-anxious presence, the two things for me are really to take the long view. And if you knew that the current challenges, that all the things that are sucky right now, are just a source of your kids' for future resilience, and that they're going to figure this out with your help, then you don't have to be as fearful about today. And secondly, just enjoy your kids, because it so often feels like when things aren't going well, we have to fix this thing. We put all of our energy into the things that aren't going well. And we can love our children and enjoy their company, even if their rooms, their grades, and their life is a mess. Bill had a kid he was working with who was just, everything was hard. He was 19, he just dropped out of college for the second time. And Bill asked him, said, is there something your parents could have done when you're younger that you feel like would have helped? And the kid said, It would have been nice if they acted like they were happy to see me once in a while.
Oh,
Ouch,
yeah.
right? And so there are enough people listening to your podcast. There has to be someone whose kid is anxious or is depressed or is institutionalized or is struggling with drugs or is, I mean, on and, just diagnosed endlessly because, endlessly. I mean, I won't go in. I mean, I kid who 2 years ago, my son had a brain tumor. I mean, and when things are hard, they're hard.
Yeah.
And especially when things are hard and especially when things are hard for our kids, that's where we want to throw our arms around the most and say, no matter what you do, no matter how hard you work, and I want you to work hard because I want you to build the life that you want. But honest to gosh, no matter how hard you work, I love you from the top of your head to bottom of your toes.
I love that. Thank you so much,
You're
Ned.
welcome.
Thank you for being here, and see you next time, School Psych Podcast fans and friends. Thank you for being here too.
Have a great start to school.
Yes. Bye, everyone.